Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheila with your story for this week. And the story is called Just Suppose. Well, Donnie, he was walking beside his dad, and it was a cold, brisk morning. He lived on a farm, and he and his dad were on the way to the barn to milk the cows. Well, all along that road that went to the barn, yes, it was a dirt road. There were big puddles, and they were all full of frozen ice. And every single puddle that Donnie came to, he jumped up and he jumped into it. And that ice went crack. He loved that sound. And then the muddy water underneath would oosh, oosh up all the way over top of his feet, and he could feel the cold and the tingliness of it. He had on his own farmer's boots, so his feet weren't getting wet. But every single puddle he did that in, he jumped in it and listened to it crack and felt that water. Well, finally, when he had jumped in the last puddle right before they got to the barn, his dad, he looked down at his little boy. He was having so much fun with that ice. Well, over under the eaves of the corner of the barn was a big metal barrel, and that barrel was what they called a rain barrel. And a lot of the people and the farmers and that would have a big barrel sitting by their barn, or even some places by their houses, and it would fill with rainwater. Now, rainwater, they use for lots of things. Used to be that ladies liked to wash their hair in it because it had different minerals in it and made them look good. Well, here was that barrel. And when the dad started to walk by, he looked in it. Now, that barrel was probably, I don't know, 4.5 feet maybe off the ground. And when Dad looked down inside of it, the whole top of the water, now the barrel was about half full, but the whole top of that water was frozen solid. And Danny's dad, got a good idea. He took his fist and he went into the top of that, and the ice broke. Then Danny's dad reached down in there with his long arm, and he pulled out a big piece of ice. It was clear ice from that clean water, and it was, well, it wasn't totally square. It had broken off. But he picked it up and he said, "Here, Danny, you can play with this while you wait for me to get ready to milk. Then I'll call you and you can come help." Well, Donnie, he looked at that piece of glass. He put it up and he peered through it at the rising sun. And those sun rays going through that big chunk of ice made beautiful patterns and different colors. Oh, but as he held on to that ice, even though he had on his gloves, his hands were warm. And do you know what happens to ice when it gets warm? Well, all along the edges where Donnie had been holding on, the ice started to melt and the water started running down. And as Danny was holding it, he lost control of it and it fell splat on the ground. into 100 pieces, just like glass. Oh, he was having such a good time. He thought. Dad hadn't called him yet from inside the barn, so he went over to where that big rain barrel was. And he stood on his tiptoes and he looked down inside of it. And sure enough, where his dad has taken his fist and he had pounded in there, there were more chunks of ice. And he saw a great big one that he wanted to have to play with. He took his arm and he hung it over the edge. Now you have to consider, Donnie wasn't too big. I'm imagining, I don't know for sure, but I'm imagining that he was 6, maybe a little younger, maybe a little older, I don't know. But when he took his arm to reach in there, he couldn't reach down far enough. And he sat there and he thought, what can I do? He peeked over the top of the edge of the barrel again. Then he got an idea. He reached up with his hands and he pulled himself up onto the edge of that barrel. And then he could see down. He was laying on his tummy on the top of that barrel with his legs stuck out behind him, flailing in the air. And he was holding on to the edge. And he was looking down in there to reach in to get that piece of ice. And when he went to reach, it happened. Danny still doesn't know for sure what happened, whether the edges of that barrel were covered with ice and they were slick. He didn't know. Maybe he just lost his balance trying to balance on that little round edge of that metal barrel. But he went head first into that barrel, and his hands were pinned to his sides, and his head went right down, splash, into that water with the little pieces of ice floating around. And of course, Danny's first thought was to push himself up with his hands, but his hands were trapped. He didn't have anything to use, and he held his breath, and he wiggled and he squirmed. But his head was under his water, and he couldn't breathe. And it wasn't too long till all of a sudden everything went black and quiet. Well, Dad didn't know that anything had happened with Danny, and Danny's mommy was in the house. I said, Danny, his name's Donnie. Well, you know, in a story, sometimes there is dot, 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 and you know that the next part of it may have happened somewhere else than where the original story was. Well, Mr. Rice, he was an older gentleman that for years and years had driven the milk truck. He drove from farm to farm with his big tanker truck, and he would pick up the milk every morning from each of the farms. Well, you know, he never had a schedule. Some days he'd stop at this farm first. Some days he'd stop at another one. Sometimes he left early, and sometimes he left later, just depending on what was going on. And sometimes, matter of fact, a lot of the time, he would visit with the farmers before he went on his way to the next farm to get their milk to put in his big tank truck. But this morning, for some reason, Mr. Rice was early, and he chose to go to Donnie's farm first. He drove down the driveway. It was a gloriously beautiful sunny morning. It was cold, but it was beautiful. And he jumped down out of his truck cab and slammed the door shut. And he started to walk to the barn, which was what he always did. But as he was looking around it this morning, he saw something. Over under the eaves of the barn was that big, round, tall metal barrel. And out of the top of the metal barrel were two little rubber boots sticking up in the air. Mr. Rice, he ran as fast as he could over to that barrel. He grabbed a hold of those two legs and he pulled. But Danny wasn't breathing. And Mr. Rice grabbed him and he started calling, "Help! Help! Help! Somebody help!" Well, Donnie's dad heard him and he came running outside and he saw Mr. Rice with his son just laying limply in his arms. Well, Dad and Mr. Rice, they started working on Danny, doing everything they could to try to get him to start to breathe again. And finally, after what seemed like an eternity to them, Donnie, he started sputtering and coughing, and finally he took a big breath. Well, Mr. Rice and Donnie's dad rushed with him into the warm house. And as they were coming in, Donnie's dad was telling the mom all about what had happened. And tears were running down her face. And she grabbed and she kissed him. And she went and made a little bed in the corner by the wood stove. And she put her boy down. Just suppose, boys and girls, that when Mr. Rice got up that morning, he took longer than the usual time to eat his breakfast. Just suppose when he was driving through that little town, that the light in the middle of town had turned red and he had to wait. Just suppose that that was a day that he chose to go to one of the other farms first. Boys and girls, I don't think those supposes happened by accident. I know that God cares for us, and I know that sometimes He arranged circumstances to help us, and He will do the same for you. You know, Donnie grew up to be a minister, and when he goes to preach about the love of God, here in his heart, he knows it's true because God saved him. Thank you, boys and girls. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.